Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. We're at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire at the INET conference. This was the birthplace of the International Monetary Fund. And now joining us to discuss this conference and the economy and politics in America is Tom Ferguson. Tom teaches at the University of Massachusetts in Boston and is senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Thanks for joining us.
Hi there.
So let me tell you how I imagine American politics after being an observer and being in D.C. and covering it.
After being a Canadian.
Well, I'm an American too. I got both hats on
I understand.
here. So I imagine watching the Tudors on television where you see British aristocrats all vying for power to influence the king, to appoint the king, to take down the king. And I imagine America's not so far from that. In America, what you have is you have a stratum of billionaires, some maybe multimillionaires get kind of close to this.
It does have an uncomfortable resemblance to some of Shakespeare's history plays.
I
agree with that.
And at least in England, it was all kind of out in the open. Here's the lords, and they're the ones that own the land, and here's the king, and everybody kind of, peasants are peasants, and the church plays its role, and everybody kind of knows this is a class society.
Do you think this could be true, Paul?
So, like in America, you've got these billionaires read the lords, but between them and the public, you have politicians who are so dependent, most of them, not all, but most, so
Just
dependent.
about all of them need a very large amount of money to run for anything.
And as they say, who's got the money? And if you have $1 per vote, who gets to vote
Maybe
most?
Michael Bloomberg could finance his own campaign, but even he, you know, if he's thinking about running, he's not planning to finance the whole thing on his own.
Running for president, yeah.
Yeah.
So how realistic is that as a picture? Then if it is, we don't actually get to see that world of billionaires very often, except the odd movie that kind of pokes through it here and there.
Okay.
How does
Well,
what is
you got to
relationship?
remember, the only time most scholars want to say anything about anybody Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford is they want to thank them for a grant. That's your first problem in American scholarship. The journalism story is, I regret to say, about the same. I mean, the average American journalist, I have to tell you, having met a lot of them, there are some really excellent journalists out there.
And just to be fair, let's to be completely transparent here, this conference at INET is funded by George Soros, and like everywhere, you have activists.
There are
you have
always
activists about billionaires.
There are going to be exceptions.
He's also an activist.
Yeah, but fundamentally, but this is actually an important point, and it's actually here's where the billionaire story can be a little misleading. If you start adding up the sums of cash in politics, you will see very quickly that an enormous amount of it comes from corporations, and now formally from corporations, thanks to Citizens United. I will guarantee you, it's true that
very fast. Citizens United, for anyone who didn't follow it or may not live in the U.S., Supreme Court decision that says now corporations are like individuals, and they can more or less spend as much as they want on advertising with certain limits, but not many.
Yeah. But the key thing about Citizens United is you can just use direct corporate funds. You just open the gate and start handing out the money as long as it stays independent of anybody's official campaign. In other words, you can do it on your own, but hey. Okay. The thing is that there's an enormous amount of corporate cash, and yeah, the billionaires, in some sense, belong. You can range, I remember once talking to a Texas oil guy. It's a true story. This guy said to me, well, I finally sold my refinery. I split it with Mobil. We each took $500 million. This was back in the 70s, and that was a lot of money. And I thought to myself, oh, that's kind of neat. Oh, he split his refinery with Mobil. All right. Mobil is now part of Exxon. That's how the world has changed. Anyway.
But you still have billionaires having
but here's my point. You've got an enormous chunk of there's an awful lot of corporate cash out there not relatable to any individual billionaire. I mean, I actually can do a pretty good job of sorting this out. I have, and the truth is that the corporate cash, if you start to get all the banks of America, for example, to start pouring cash in to say, just to make something up that sounds completely crazy, like block Elizabeth Warren from becoming the consumer advocate inside the new Consumer Protection Agency inside the Federal Reserve, then you're looking at a sort of tsunami of cash here, and a few billionaires against that can't. I mean, those are not great odds. I'm not saying, you can't. I mean, we all know David and Goliath.
Well, you mean a few billionaires that don't want to achieve the same ends the banks do?
That's right, yeah.
Because most of the billionaires are probably on the same page the banks are.
Yeah, a lot, but you also see, like, let me guarantee you that there's a lot of hedge funds, even as we speak, that are trying not to be declared not too big to fail, and tell them, do the banks and not us. I guarantee you that right this week
Okay,
in
so you've
Washington.
got, well then,
Yeah,
okay,
but here's my point.
Let me just add one point
Yeah.
then. So you got these individual billionaires who own stuff, they're not just sitting on money.
Yeah, sure.
And they'll own important positions in these,
Yeah.
in these big corporations.
Some,
and then you've got a managerial class that runs these
Enormous, yeah.
corporations.
The Business Roundtable is mostly not billionaires. They're managerial. I mean, the CEOs are mostly, they're very rich. They're not billionaires. They're not on average.
They certainly wannabes.
That's the wannabe is one thing, the actual is another. Anyway, the point here is really, and the reason we care about this is if you're running a big business today, what the state does matter to you. It's going to matter in taxes. But, I mean, just look at the financial crisis and just sort through, I mean, the disaster that hit in 2008. You just look at the way, say, the automobile industry was treated, say, from the financial industry, more specifically the big banks. The big banks were basically rescued. The population of the United States just transferred large sums to them. The banks took that money. They basically didn't lend it out. Instead, they paid themselves huge bonuses again. They're almost back to, I mean, they've done very well for themselves out of that. And now they're turning around and saying, how dare you even think of regulating us? How crazy is that?
As opposed to the auto industry.
The auto industry, some of those folks actually went bust. Lots of people lost the CEOs were told to actually leave. Some of them got sold. Or just in the case of, say, the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA or the Federal Trade Commission or the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the real one, not the thing that's in the Fed for just financial stuff. There's a lot of stuff in modern business where the state has to intersect with it. And so, or telecommunications regulation. I mean, the entire telecom sector spends an enormous amount of money. I'd have a little, because there's so many ways to hide political money. I mean, I actually have this little table of, the spectrum of political money, and most of it is invisible to the average person.
So what's an example of how money's hidden?
Well, I mean, one very simple one is the number of people out there talking about public policy who are in fact on somebody's payroll, either directly as consultants or indirectly through a donation to a think tank.
Who wind up on cable talk shows.
Yeah. I mean, look, I remember, this is still so wonderful. I mean, there was a Brookings study before the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And there was a guy in there who wrote some essay and saying, oh, no, if you deregulate cable TV, your rates are going to go down. And I knew that was ridiculous at the time. And you show me a person whose rates have gone down since 1996. But that kind of study, that stuff is worthless. But it's, you walk, I mean, I have talked to representatives. And they will occasionally say, well, I remember getting a call on the morning that they actually put the audit the Fed provision in. This is a true story. They called me up and they said, look, could you sign a small petition? I said, sure. Well, I mean, I haven't explained. And I said, we just discovered that I think the number was 15 economists had signed a petition saying this was a terrible idea to audit the Fed. And then we've just discovered that I think it was about 9 of them were Federal Reserve consultants. And so we need some folks to just tell the caucus, that they're going to vote on this today, that this is not crazy. And I said, it's not going to make your hair fall out. Children will still be born normal with all their limbs. No, go ahead and audit the Fed. Nothing terrible will happen. And they actually took it down that day to the cut, and it went over that day. Barney Frank made a pitch against it, and then Grayson from Florida made a pitch for it with that petition.
This is the one
Alan
combined
Grayson.
with Ron Paul.
Yes, that was a sort of left-right coalition. Yeah, the Libertarians.
The other big example is the healthcare debate. When First of all, the White House was so afraid of the pharmaceutical industry, they made a kind of sweetheart deal
That's
right
right.
in the beginning.
Yeah,
not
they
to
told,
get
yeah, they told you
you'll
they don't
stay
have
out of
to
the ad
bargain.
wars.
The government won't bargain the prices of pharmaceuticals down. How crazy is that?
But then they go to war, and you can start to see
Yeah.
all of a sudden there's a mass movement against some health care reform, which
Right.
which makes no sense given how badly people need health insurance.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, there was a lot. That was something like. It reminds me of the what was that 1813 Battle of the Nations outside Leipzig, where something like 7 or 9 kingdoms had armies. I mean, the healthcare thing. We could do a whole segment on that. I think that is actually quite worth taking apart because it was so big and so complex, and any number of these folks who were in there had enough money that would in normal times have actually just sufficed to deliver a majority in Congress for probably anything. The problem was that they were now heavily contesting among each other there. So the point to sort of grasp here is it's a mistake to portray American politics as sort of Iliad or the Odyssey, where the gods, meaning some billionaires, look down on the rest of us and just do their thing. Well, they'd like to help these mortals or that mortals. Far better to understand that the state systematically affects business. So businesses are systematically trying to affect the state. And an awful lot of the rhetoric on this stuff, I mean, you know what the oldest trick in the book is as well as I do, which is if you don't like what your regulator is doing to you, you start calling it socialism. And immediately, people snap to attention. In the long run, we are all red. Sort of paranoia hits. I mean, this stuff is really nuts. I mean, I remember the healthcare debate. I remember having an argument with a New York Times correspondent because a guy had done a very nice so-called event analysis of a vote in the Senate, one of the Senate committees on health care. And what it was an unexpected result. You say, how can this be unexpected? I'm going to stipulate it's true. Okay? That is, the health insurers had won the vote somewhat unexpectedly, and their stocks popped up actually within minutes of that. They went up well above the market as a whole. And this guy sort of showed you this is what's going on in here. And then you had all these folks who didn't like the health bill screaming state socialism while the market as a whole is going way up because they're in the middle of a big rally. And I said, guys, now I went to the Times guy, one of their financial folks, and I said, now this is a really interesting story. This is as clear an evidence as you will ever find that we're dealing with, in effect, redistribution inside business sectors. And their response to me was, this is not news. But I don't understand how that's not news, but the U.S. Chamber of Commerce just telling everybody this is socialism is news. You tell me that news judgment. You try to tell me how it's rational.
Well, I guess that goes back to who owns the media. Thanks for joining us, Tom. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.